The hall was drowned in restless murmurs, the chandeliers above swaying slightly as though even the air itself sensed the storm about to erupt. Camera flashes strobed across the packed chamber. Journalists pressed against their railings like hunters ready to capture the kill. And on the raised stage stood Donald Trump, chin thrust forward, his voice swelling with the confidence of a man who believed history bent under his will, his finger stabbing toward the cameras as he thundered, "We'll crush Africa in any war, you hear me? Crush it so completely that no one will ever again dare to challenge American might." His words reverberating across marble walls like cannon fire, and for a heartbeat there was silence, an electrified silence, sharp and dangerous, until, from the opposite side of the long polished table where leaders had gathered, Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier president whose very name had begun to echo through villages and deserts as a symbol of defiance, rose slowly, every eye swiveling toward him, his military jacket catching the light, his boots striking the floor with deliberate weight, his jaw set as though carved from stone, and then his voice, low but laced with steel, cut through the charged air. "Then step onto the battlefield. Cowards." A gasp erupted from the audience, half disbelief, half exhilaration, as though the script of global politics had just been torn and rewritten before their eyes. Reporters nearly dropping their pens in the rush to capture the reply. The cameras zooming frantically to freeze the moment when defiance stared power in the face, and Trump's expression flickered. The smug grin faltering, replaced by something darker, something that betrayed the sudden recognition that this was no ordinary exchange of words, but a challenge hurled like a gauntlet at the feet of an empire. Secret Service agents tensed, shifting subtly closer, their earpieces buzzing with coded whispers, while African delegates leaned forward, eyes burning with a pride they had been denied for centuries, whispering to one another that at last someone had dared to speak the words they had all carried in silence. Yet even as tension coiled tighter, the cameras kept rolling, broadcasting this collision of egos and histories into millions of homes, into dusty villages where radios crackled with static but carried every word, into crowded cities where youth pressed against store windows to watch the live feeds, their hearts hammering with the intoxicating thought that perhaps the balance of power was tilting before their very eyes. And Traoré did not sit, he did not blink, he simply stood there, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a soldier prepared not for applause but for war, his eyes fixed on Trump as though daring him to repeat the threat face to face without the shield of rhetoric. While Trump adjusted his tie, leaned toward the microphone, and barked, "Don't test me, boy, you're playing with fire, and America has never lost a war it truly fought." His voice attempting thunder but cracking just slightly at the edges, a fissure of doubt that millions watching caught and dissected, while Traoré, lips curling into the faintest of grim smiles, replied not with further words but with a silence so heavy it pressed on the room like a weight, forcing even the loudest commentators to hesitate before speaking. And in that silence the echoes of history whispered, of colonial chains, of battlefields soaked with both defiance and blood, of speeches that promised liberation but delivered exploitation, and now a new line had been drawn. The moderator, voice trembling, tried to redirect the discussion to policy, to trade agreements, to the scripted agenda that had been carefully designed to avoid such confrontations, but no one listened. Not the leaders, not the audience, not the millions glued to their screens. All eyes remained locked on the invisible line that had just been carved between two men, two continents, two visions of the future, and like actors swept into a script far larger than themselves, they could not step away. Trump's supporters in the chamber erupted in applause, chanting his name as though to drown out the tremor that had passed through him, but their chants collided with the thunderous cheers of African delegates and youth representatives who rose to their feet, fists clenched high, shouting Traoré's name, their voices merging into a tidal wave that shook the hall, and for a moment it seemed the very ground trembled under the weight of clashing worlds, while security forces exchanged nervous glances, their hands hovering near holsters, uncertain if words would give way to something far more dangerous. And through it all the cameras rolled, immortalizing the moment when arrogance met defiance, when Trump's warning of crushing war was met not with fear, but with an invitation to battle, a reply that would be replayed across every network, dissected in every analysis, and remembered in every street corner where people longed for a leader who would not bow. Trump's jaw tightened, the familiar rhythm of insult deflect dominate struggling to return, his eyes darting across the hall as though searching for an ally strong enough to smother the wildfire Traoré had ignited. But what he saw unsettled him, the rigid silence of European allies calculating costs, the unblinking gaze of Asian envoys taking mental notes, and the roaring approval rising from African delegations, who sensed in Traoré's words a rebirth of dignity that had been chained for centuries. And Trump leaned forward, fists clenched on the podium, voice booming louder to reclaim ground. America doesn't need to step onto your battlefield, because the battlefield already belongs to us. We own the skies, the seas, the banks, the weapons. Everything you cling to is ours. And his words echoed like a sledgehammer, yet somehow landed hollow, because in the corner of the screen, split feeds showed African youth in Bamako, in Ouagadougou, in Lagos, in Kinshasa, watching together in cafes and courtyards, their faces lit by flickering televisions, erupting in cheers not for Trump's threats but for Traoré's defiance, chanting his name as though he were a soldier standing beside them. And back in the hall, Traoré finally moved, stepping forward into the center of the spotlight, his boots striking the polished floor with the cadence of a march, his voice rising not in anger but in conviction. You claim to own the seas, yet our ancestors crossed them in chains and still survived. You claim to own the skies, yet your bombs only fertilized our resolve. You claim to own the banks, yet our people still build markets in the dust. You claim to own the weapons, but remember, when the ground shakes beneath your feet, it is not guns that save you, it is courage. And the chamber erupted again, some gasping at the audacity, others pounding the tables in furious applause, while Trump slammed a hand against the podium, shouting, "You're nothing but a rebel in a uniform," and rebels always fall. But Traoré leaned closer to his microphone, eyes locked on him, and replied with a voice like a blade slicing through the fog. Empires fall faster. Gasps sliced through the room. Analysts watching on split screens scrambled to rewrite their scripts, commentators whispering that this was no longer debate but declaration, and in living rooms across the world people leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing not a policy summit, but the opening act of a confrontation destined to shape generations. And suddenly the lights flickered as though even the hall itself strained under the weight of the moment. Security agents whispering into earpieces, diplomats scribbling frantic notes, and yet the cameras never looked away from the two figures at the center. Trump gripping the podium like a fortress crumbling in slow motion, and Traoré standing tall, his voice steady, his defiance unshaken, the embodiment of a continent refusing to kneel. And though no bullets had been fired, no troops deployed, the air felt thick as a battlefield smoke, each word exchanged like artillery, each stare like the drawing of a sword, and somewhere in the shadows of the hall, history itself seemed to lean in, waiting to record who would flinch first. Trump exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring as he jabbed a finger toward Traoré, his voice carrying the fury of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. You think your words make you strong. Words don't win wars, armies do. Economies do. Power does. And America has more power in a single aircraft carrier than your continent has in 1,000 years. The arrogance rolling off him in waves. Yet beneath it, the cameras caught the twitch of unease at the corner of his eye, a flicker of recognition that Traoré's defiance had not only pierced him, but was spreading like wildfire across the watching world. And Traoré did not flinch, did not blink, instead stepping closer into the blinding stage lights until his shadow fell long across the marble, his tone calm but layered with thunder. Power? If power is measured in machines, then yes, you have more. But if power is measured in the will to stand, the courage to bleed, the hunger to live free, then America is already weak, because courage cannot be bought, cannot be built in a factory, cannot be flown on wings of steel. It is born in the dust, in the fire, in the struggle, and Africa has never lacked struggle. And the words landed with the weight of drums in a battlefield dawn, resonating across the chamber, drawing gasps from diplomats and clenched fists of solidarity from African delegates. And in faraway villages where electricity flickered, elders nodded gravely at radios crackling with his words, whispering that at last a young lion had roared on their behalf. And Trump pounded the podium again, shouting, "We'll sanction you, we'll starve you, we'll bury your economies until your people beg us for crumbs." And Traoré tilted his head, a soldier's half-smile curling his lips, replying like a commander delivering an order to history itself. Then let them eat pride, because pride is not yours to steal. And the chamber erupted, some in rage, some in awe, the collision of voices deafening, security pushing toward the stage as though preparing for an eruption. And Trump raised his voice above the chaos. "You dare mock the might of America? We'll crush you in days." And Traoré's answer came like a blade unsheathed in silence, sharp and final. Then step onto the battlefield. Cowards. The repetition of his first defiance delivered now with a finality that turned the room into stone, as if every word was a drumbeat summoning a war long suppressed. And across continents, youth watching on cracked screens shouted his reply into the night, their voices carrying through streets and alleyways, echoing off walls painted with murals of struggle. While in the chamber, Trump's face flushed red, his shoulders heaving, his empire suddenly smaller in the reflection of a soldier who carried no bombs, no banks, only the unshakable conviction that history belonged not to the loudest, not to the richest, but to the bravest. And though no treaty was signed, no bullet fired, the world knew something irreversible had been unleashed. The clash of arrogance and defiance now etched into the narrative of a century. And as cameras zoomed in, catching every beat of sweat, every defiant gleam, it became clear to millions watching that this was not just a battle of men but of eras. The fading roar of an empire against the rising thunder of a continent that refused to kneel. And as silence finally fell, thick and heavy, the world held its breath, waiting for which drum would beat next. The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring, the audience caught between awe and dread, until Trump finally broke it with a growl, his voice strained. "You don't understand the weight of what you've just said. Boy, you've signed your own destruction." But even as the words left his mouth, they rang hollow, for the cameras showed not a towering empire but a man rattled, his bravado crumbling before the quiet storm that was Traoré. And the young soldier did not retreat, instead stepping closer, boots clicking like war drums, his presence filling the chamber, his voice rising with a conviction that pierced through centuries of chains and shadows. "If destruction is the price of dignity, then let the fire come, because we will not kneel again." And at those words the chamber shook with gasps, half in terror, half in awe, the sound of history rewriting itself in real time and across Africa. In villages where drums still carried messages faster than radios. In cities where youth filled the streets watching on giant screens. In classrooms where children leaned in close to hear every word. The reply spread like lightning, igniting chants, igniting songs, igniting hope. And Trump, red-faced, slammed the podium so hard microphones screeched, shouting, "You think you can fight us? You think you can stand against America? We'll unleash everything. We'll drown your lands. We'll burn your skies. We'll bury your futures." The fury of empire spilling out like a storm. But Traoré raised a hand, silencing the room with nothing more than presence. His eyes locked on Trump with the steady fire of a soldier who had walked through death and returned unbroken. And his voice fell quiet but carried further than any roar. "Empires always say they will burn the world, until the world realizes the empire is afraid." And the words struck like thunder, the chamber exploding in chaos, cheers, boos, fists pounding tables, cameras flashing as if desperate to capture every spark. And still Traoré stood calm, immovable, his silence after the words louder than Trump's tirade, his defiance more commanding than fleets or missiles. And the cameras panned between them. One man sweating, fists clenched, his empire behind him trembling, the other standing tall, young yet carrying the weight of ancestors who had endured centuries unshaken, unafraid. And in that frozen frame the world understood that though no guns had fired, a battle had been fought and its echoes would last for generations. Because power had been challenged, arrogance had been defied, and a new story had been written. Not in treaties, not in blood yet, but in the unbreakable courage of words sharpened into weapons, words that crossed oceans, words that stirred nations, words that whispered in every corner of the earth that the age of cowards ruling over the brave was ending. And as the summit adjourned in chaos, reporters screaming into microphones, leaders whispering frantic strategies, youth pouring into streets across continents, Trump stormed out, his shadow long but shaken, while Traoré remained unbowed, unbroken, his figure lit against the glare of cameras, the embodiment of a continent rising. And as the final broadcast replayed his words, "Then step onto the battlefield. Cowards," the world knew it had witnessed more than rhetoric. It had witnessed the spark of a movement, the moment when defiance became destiny, and in that spark history turned.